Give you some feedback on your draft work. So I'm going to start off by saying you've done a very good job on this. It's well researched and you've put a lot of effort into it. So what I'm going to suggest now are a few minor tweaks, but you're pretty much there with it. If you were to just finish it off and submit it now, you'd pass. And what I'm going to suggest now is kind of a final bit of polish for it. So we'll just talk our way down through it. Couple of minor things to point out as we go. So for example, the first time you use an abbreviation, it's recommended that you write it out in full and put the abbreviation after it in brackets. So you'd say the registered veterinary nurse and then RVN in brackets. And that way then you can refer to RVN thereafter and your reader will know what you mean. Okay, if you just, again, you'll be given it a careful proofread at the end to pick up on things like missing commas and so on. So it's the role of the veterinary nurse. So you want to put a apostrophe in there before the S to indicate that it's the nurse that is doing the job. Grand. Then you've started off by explaining a little bit of your history and why you've picked the topic. You could maybe expand on this little bit here, the reflective bit. Not massively, maybe another paragraph on what you hope to learn from researching this topic and how you might use it in the future would be helpful. If you have a look on Moodle, I have that reflective flow chart there, which is helpful. And if you open that on a PC or a laptop, the chart won't distort and you can see it's just an example of some terminology you could use to help you reflect a little bit more in this section. Then you moved on to explain why you picked it. And again, you're talking about the clinical relevance here, which is great. So this bit's fine. I'd like to see a little bit more on, just a line or two on why you might use this in the future. Okay. You've mentioned that if the animal doesn't get enough colostrum, all these things can go wrong. So I'd probably put in a few citations there to support that. You have the citations in further along, but any time where you're making a statement that you're basing on the literature, I'd put in the citation to support it. Okay. And you've also made the very valid point that this type of work can be done by the veterinary nurse and you can also show others how to do it. So there's a valuable training element to this as well as obviously patient care. Then you've moved on to talk about the fact that foals are agammaglobulinemic when they're born, so they're entirely dependent on colostrum. There's no transplacental transfer of antibodies. And you've explained how normally foals get up and drink and get their colostrum intake in the first few hours of life. And I like the fact that you're putting in some numbers here, so you're giving people data on how much to ensure the foal receives. You've got some nice illustrations in. I would suggest maybe make the illustration bigger and put it in between the paragraphs rather than in line with it. Having them in line like this tends to make your formatting jump around all over the place, which can be problematic. So I would suggest make this bigger and put it in the middle and then put this paragraph either above or below it, just to make life easier for you when it comes to the final submission. Then you've explained what the immunoglobulins are and how much we're looking for, so that's all grand and all the things that can lead to their low or lack. Then you've talked about assessing colostrum and you've mentioned the different ways of doing it. So you've mentioned your bricks, your refractometry using your colostrometer, and then you've talked about what values we're looking for. And then you've also talked about the colostrometers that aren't that reliable. If you want to put in the digital refractometer, you can as well. You use that in Joe's first practical class, which is the one where you drop the colostrum onto the prism. I find that great for colostrum because it's much harder to read colostrum than it is to read, say, urine. Likewise, if you want to take some photographs of how to use a refractometer, feel free to ask me to arrange to borrow the ones down in the lab. You can cheat. I either have frozen colostrum in the freezer you can use, or you can cheat by using Avonmore vanilla protein milk, which looks the same and measures about the same on a refractometer, which is quite handy. Then you've talked about what happens to the colostrum once it gets into the foal. It's probably worth expanding here as well on the role of suckling. So we know there's some literature to support the fact that the act of suckling promotes IgG uptake as well, which is helpful, and it promotes gut closure. So it reduces the amount of bacteria that can follow the antibodies across the foal's digestive tract, which is helpful. And probably worth thinking about hygiene as well. We want the foals to get up and drink the mare's colostrum, but not to lick lots of dirt off her udder and off the environment while they're ingesting the antibodies. So that's maybe something you could put in, but not a huge amount on it, but just you could add it in there. Really important question, has the foal had enough colostrum? And you've mentioned the various tests that you can do. I just clarified there, it's plasma IgG. We've talked about measuring the antibodies in the colostrum in the previous section. Now you're on to measuring antibodies in the foal. So it's a blood sample that we need. Then you've talked about the different types. So as you said, the immunodiffusion is very good but not that practical. Zinc sulfate and latex agglutination are okay, but they're a bit fiddly. But the ELISA tests are probably what's most widely used in practice now because they're very straightforward. And you've got your pictures of them there. That's great. And I really like the fact that you've differentiated between foals at 12 hours of age and foals at 24 hours of age, because a lot happens in those 12 hours in relation to IgG uptake. So that's really useful clinical point to make. Why might it happen? So you've talked about the things that could go wrong. As you say, it's either there's not enough colostrum, they didn't get enough colostrum, or they didn't absorb it. So they're the three main criteria. And I like this, again, a very practical point. Even if you give them really good quality colostrum, if their gut's not working properly and they can't absorb it, you can still end up with IgG levels that are below what we want. So again, it reiterates the value of that follow-up blood sample to check for IgG levels post colostrum intake. Really practical as well. What should I do if my mare has no colostrum or she ran milk or whatever the case might be? So you've talked about that a factor can be frozen. You could probably expand on that slightly, because that's something you might find yourself having to explain to a client how to do, or they might want to set up a colostrum bank. So you could probably expand on that a wee bit. You've discussed then the other options, such as bovine colostrum or the commercially available dried colostrum for foals, and that's as far as you've got now. So yeah, I think it's come together really well, Sinead. You're on the right track. I enjoyed reading it. It's really practical, it's evidence-based, it would be useful to people in practice. So keep up the good work, and you're nearly there with it. Your references look good as well. You've got a good range of resources there. You're drawing them from evidence-based literature, not just kind of generic owner-indicated sites. So I'm happy you've got the information you need to do it, and I'm looking forward to seeing the finished product. You're nearly there with it. Thank you, Sinead.